All right. Welcome everyone to the Thursday, April 22nd, 2021 Helm Developer Call. The agenda, Bridget has already nicely pasted into chat here. And first up, we have one announcement, and it's got my name next to it. I don't think I remember adding this, but it's got my name next to it.
I did.
Yeah. May 26th, it is a Wednesday, is the planned date for the Helm 3.6.0, which should target support for Kubernetes 1.21. Probably the week before, and the Monday of that week is when we will cut the release candidate. So now we've got a little less than a month until we cut that release candidate to get any pull requests, bug fixes, other things into 3.6.0. So that's the big thing to know is the Monday of the week before is usually when we cut the release candidate. So if you've got something you want in, now's the time to work on it so you can get it reviewed and iterated on. All right. Yeah.
I thought I heard you say that it's the Monday the week of, and then you just said the Monday the week before. Can you clarify?
The Monday of the week before, because we want to give it several days of soak time. And this way, if we have to cut more than one release candidate, we have time without pushing out the date. So it's usually the Monday of the week prior. So in this case, let me pull up the calendar.
May 17th.
The 17th? Okay.
It's also tax day in the US. That'll be an exciting day.
We have different versions of exciting. All right. But that is the day that we will cut the release candidate. Does anyone have any other announcements? Going once, going twice. All right. Then we can move on to our discussion, and we've got several discussion topics. The first one is from Dr. Butcher about the HIP for Helm 4 planning and development process. The floor is yours, Matt.
Okay. I can't find the tab that I have this HIP open in. Yeah, so the HIP is essentially trying to...
Matt, real quick, at least to me, your mic sounds very quiet.
There we go. I forgot that I had to actually put it in front of my mouth. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. These microphone things, man, they're really complicated to work. Yeah, the HIP is... Hang on, I'm going to open it up here. Or did somebody drop a link already? I'm slow. The HIP is basically designed to get us started on thinking about how we want to do Helm 4 development and providing us that kind of structure we didn't make explicit last time. So essentially, who's going to be responsible for making decisions on things? How are we going to move the release process forward? What are going to be the gating factors and stuff like that? So I just took a stab at something and figured we could all start working on refining it. I think Fisher had already had some suggestions on here that have already been reincorporated into the current version. I think, yes, I did have those, push those up, but by no means was the rough draft intended to be the final draft. So most specifically, the things I wanted to kind of be able to call out about this proposal is that, borrowing the idea from other open source communities, it calls for a release engineer who basically will manage the life cycle of determining which things from HIPs get rolled into the official list of things that have to be done, how that individual is going to measure the progress of the releases and things like that, some minimum and maximum or minimum time windows for how long we have to be in particular stages to rebuff the criticism we got last time that nobody knew how long it was going to be in discussion before, some things like that to basically try and work around the problems we had last time. And then there is also a caveat that that Fisher added or suggested adding, basically saying if we start the Helm 4 process and it doesn't attract the engineering effort that we need, here's how we stop the process and stay on Helm 3 for a while longer, which I thought was a great addition, because I think given the way things have gone in past versions where it really fell upon one or two engineers to do the vast majority of the work on it, this prevents that from happening again. So please take a look at the proposal. Feel free to comment on it, and I will just keep updating it. Since this is a process proposal, I think it requires, okay, Fisher, you're gonna have to correct me here. Does this one require org maintainer acceptance for this one?
No, generally, because this is related to a specific project. Like if you think about this, if Chart Museum was coming out with a process proposal for how they would go about doing their next release, it's probably the most relevant to the Chart Museum maintainers to go and talk about and discuss that and say, okay, we've come to consensus and said, this seems great to me.
Okay.
So I think this is best to be laid on the project maintainers. If there is conflict or if there's a disagreement on that, then we can escalate to org maintainers, but I think it's best to leave it to just the project maintainers.
Okay. And then finally, I don't think we need to necessarily rush this proposal through. The idea is to get this proposal kind of looked at by the invested parties, and then we can try and improve it. So it's not like we want to get this done by next week or something like that. We probably want, until May or something like that to make sure that we've, or mid to end of May, to make sure that everyone who needs to has had a chance to weigh in. Then once this process is in place, then we can officially begin the process of triaging what would go into Helm for soliciting feature hips and things like that. I think this proposal is pretty explicit that that feature hips will be the way that we do the design. And the reason for that is because in Helm 3, the design was done in one gigantic design document. And we surprisingly got very negative feedback on that method, because the reception was one person, who happened to be me, was the sole person to triage all of the design decisions, which was true because we were building a single product. So the idea here is to move it to hips go in as the feature descriptions, and then the release engineer, who I hope will not be me, will be responsible for saying, okay, this is how these hips all line up and how we get them into it. So it really it sort of distinguishes a little more that the architecting phase is really aligning all of the separate hips to make one cohesive project. So hopefully that will dispel some of the concerns with the single design document that we had from last time.
Well, to be fair, you still need that single design document, but you're saying that that's more of somebody who's keeping an eye on all the different hips and ensuring that they align well together.
Yeah, so the criticism I got last time was, well, because you're doing the single design document, basically you're rejecting anybody's ideas you don't like, which was, I thought in some ways true, but in some ways not without consideration of all of these ideas. But in this case, at least people then would feel like they got control over their proposal, and we either accept or reject the hip that they ultimately propose. And then you're right. I mean, ultimately, the release engineer has got to be able to have the authority to say, this is how this is going to work, because otherwise this is going to look like Howl's Moving Castle instead of the Cinderella Castle. So I don't know where that particular metaphor came from, but so this is kind of trying to put a few more guardrails to prevent us from the criticisms that it was, an authoritarian deal, but also still make it so that at the end of the day we build a cohesive project that people will be able to use to get their work done. So again, yeah, and thank you. That was good input. And if there are things in there that you see that you can say, okay, we should define how that particular thing works, feel free to drop some comments in there, and I will I'll probably try and loop back on that early next week to address comments, to give everybody a chance to kind of take a full read through it without me constantly merging in changes to the document. That's all I really wanted to present on that, but I'm happy to discuss.
Hey, Matt, I was just wondering if we could put May 20th down as that meeting, as a date to revisit and finalize.
I have no problem with that. Does anybody have strong feels about doing it sooner, later, or around then?
That sounds good, because we have the conference and everybody's got lots of activity around the conference going on. We should probably, our meeting after KubeCon, Cloud Native Con, have a reminder to everybody at that meeting to go back and read it, because I expect everybody's busy leading up and through that. So sounds good.
Out of curiosity, is there a kind of a main topic for Helm 4 or not yet?
No, I was kind of figuring if we got the process in, the release engineer would have the freedom to help kind of define what that would be. Fisher, when bringing this up in his comments, pointed out that unlike Helm 3, we're not necessarily playing catch up with Kubernetes the way we were then. And so we do actually have more freedom this time to say what we really want to do is X. So I would hope that, you know, if we get a good passionate release engineer who says this is going to be our kind of unifying principle for Helm 4, then we would be able to have some guidance on that, overarching guidance.
And some of us have been, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, yeah. So a quick follow-up question on Helm 4 in general. Apart from doing a Helm 4 to be able to make breaking API changes, in the proposal, and I didn't read it very carefully, so feel free to tell me, go read it again. Are there any high-level themes that we want to tackle when we do Helm 4? Some key user experience changes, some key design changes that we want to do, and that's why we are doing a Helm 4, other than the breaking API changes. I just wanted to find that out.
I will just say I intentionally didn't put any in this proposal because I wanted the process, but go ahead, Matt. I think we have some, but.
Yeah, I would argue that we need to separate the process from the content. And this does that, right? So the process gets worked out. And then I think there are a number of things that we would like to do differently, both in the SDK. I'll speak as somebody who's using the SDK. I want the SDK to have some changes to it, and you can't do that without making breaking changes. And there's a number of feature changes we'd like to do. And I just don't think they've been collected all together someplace. So by actually defining the process, setting kickoff dates and things like that, we can start to formulate what those are, because we're going to have to describe them and argue them. Then we can all bring them into that process and start to have conversations about it. And I think by defining this, it enables us now to stop thinking about the next feature release and to think about, in the bigger picture, what would we like to do?
Makes sense. Thank you very much.
Anything else? Then we can go to the next item on here, and that is from Bridget with the Helm org audit process. Bridget?
Oh, right. So I put a few links in the notes, and I'll drop them in the chat as well. Just a reminder, we've had some good progress. Carlos went through and did a bunch of his branch renames. I have started going around to repos, and I'll poke at Farina and say, I asked you a question, for example, but GitHub's notifications being what they are, you are now seeing it. This is where we're just trying to figure out, let's do a little cleanup, especially if we're starting to talk about Helm 4. If we have completely defunct, not going to be updated anymore repos, we don't need to do a branch rename on them, but we probably need to do an archive. So just giving a status report that this is progressing, and I think it will probably continue to progress. That's all I have on that.
Yeah. And from my perspective, Bridget, I will be happy to tackle that stuff after KubeCon, Cloud Native Con. I've been scrambling on other things up through then. And then at that point, let's knock a bunch of that out of the park. I'll help.
So say we all.
All right. I think we're good on that one. So we can go to the next topic, which has a couple of people on it, about Helm integration with Argo CD. Do we have somebody on who wants to talk about that?
Yeah. Hi, good evening from Germany, from the second Fisher in the call. Yeah, so let me quickly introduce myself. So my name is Jan, and I'm a maintainer for the Argo CD project. And we do have a quite tight integration with Helm. And recently in our community, some people reported that they can't, or they are unable to correctly install some charts with Argo CD. And during my research, I found that these charts were using conditionals on the capabilities cube version, made assembler compare, and further researching revealed that, so we use Helm template to actually render the charts to when we apply them to the cluster. And with the change to Helm 3, there was a missing parameter to specify. So in Helm version 2, this parameter has existed, and in Helm version 3, it's not there. And I've seen that there is an open PR on that matter in the Helm repository. And I just wanted to ask about this PR, maybe to draw some attention to it. I think I have discussed with Matt Fisher on this issue on GitHub. I'm not sure. I think you are Bacon Gobbler, right?
Yes, that's
yeah. And yeah, so I just wanted to draw some attention to this PR and wanted to ask if this is something you even consider to merge in the Helm v3 release, or whether we shall find another way. How can I help to make this merge actually happen? Yeah, that's.
So maybe the first question I would like to ask, because you brought up the use case there where you're talking about you're templating an existing chart and then you're deploying it through Argo CD. So I'm assuming that the chart that you're templating and deploying to it's actually being deployed to a live Kubernetes cluster, right?
Right.
So in Helm 3, one of the reasons why the Cube version was a little bit tricky was because you basically had to set that Kubernetes version ahead of time, and you had to know the live cluster's version that you were templating against. And so it became a little bit tricky, because then if you wanted to template it against the live version inside of Kubernetes, you basically had to look up that information and then set that as your Cube version parameter. In Helm 3, there's a new flag called the validate flag, which basically does that already for you. It grabs the capabilities that are available from the live cluster that you're connected to, and it sends that to the rendering engine. So for example, things like the Cube version would be fetched from the live Kubernetes cluster and then sent right into the Kubernetes or into the rendering template engine. So I'm curious if that particular feature would suffice for your use case, and if not, what would be the reasoning for like the Cube version flag as opposed to that?
Yeah, so maybe to shed some light on that, on how we actually how we integrate it, is we have a separate process that is responsible for generating manifests, and this is a very isolated process, right? So it does not have any connection to Kubernetes. And we pass, basically, we ask this repository server to render a specific set of manifests for a given application. So application is like the entity that is tied to a set of manifests on the source side, and to a destination like a cluster in the namespace. And so we would have to actually pass this information from the outside to the renderer. And this is where the Cube version flag comes into play, right? So this is what we've done with Helm v2. So, and during this process, we don't have any live information from any cluster. So we have to pass it from the outside. That's one of the core security concepts that we have, because this repository server does execute some may execute some user sublight commands as well. And yeah, this is basically the integration pattern that we have.
So no, I can understand it. I think I've heard similar stories where somebody is rendering the templates and they may not have the kube version, the kube cluster, it may be sandboxed from it when they're doing it, and they want to pass it in. So this isn't the first time I've heard that use case. We probably need to look over to it because there might be a conflict between setting the kube version and then validating as well. Because if you set the kube version to be something different from what's validated, then you also run into trouble. And so it may be one of those situations where you can only use one flag or the other, and we need to catch for that. This is one of those things, though, that might be simple enough, and with 3.6.0 coming, that we could look at it and possibly give it a review and look for those implications in time. I'll go ahead and I'll add it to the backlog for 3.6.0. Although, is this your pull request?
No, it is not. It's not my pull request. I've just during my research I found this.
Yeah.
Right. And I've seen that there was some traction on it. And then yeah.
Okay. Because this, go ahead.
Oh, that's actually a very good point, because Helm 2 did not validate the templates that were rendered against the Kubernetes cluster, i.e. like the Open API validation. That actually is a really good, not necessarily a counter argument to it, but it is something that we might want to consider with this new kube version flag. Because you might have the case where you set the kube version flag to an older version of Kubernetes or a newer version of Kubernetes. But the Open API validation that's still compiled into Helm is using that newer or older version of Kubernetes. And so you have a mismatch between the kube version that's being rendered and so what's being said by the capabilities, but then you're actually doing validation against a newer or older version of Kubernetes, and that kind of could be a design mismatch. So.
Yeah, I mean, in other words, there could be an expectation that we might have to set that even though you're generating it against a specific version of Kubernetes, it may not actually work when you deploy it. Because let's say you've actually generated templates with something which has breaking changes, or for that matter. Is that a consideration that we have to bring in with this change?
I think so, because Helm 2 did not have any validation against the Kubernetes cluster at all. But now with Helm 3, we do. And I don't think there is a way to disable that unless you, Helm template.
Right. Well, how about this? We'll need to walk through that whole thing as part of a review. So I'll take an action to go take a review of it, and we'll just have to walk through all of that and look at the implications.
And Matt, I can volunteer to do an initial in-depth review of different use cases, test cases. So if you want me to point in the right direction, please feel free to do so.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, and Bridget was going to ask the question that I was going to ask. Do we have anybody who's interested in moderator, notes, or triage for the next week? You can go ahead and put it in chat while we're talking about items. Okay. With that, do we have enough on this one?
Thank you. So yeah, I just wanted to bring it to the table, and thank you for being constructive in this matter. I think I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay. Then we can go to the next item here. I don't know that we'll get through everything in the time of the call, but it's a curiosity question. What's the due? And I don't know, is the person who asked this on?
That's me. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. So what's the due diligence needed when we do Kubernetes version bumps?
Yeah. So I think I made a PR to bump it to 1.21.
Okay.
And I know it's going to be merged eventually. I see a milestone that has been associated with it. But in general, I'm curious, what are the things that I should generally be looking at? I think docs, that's separate. That's not something that's going to break things or set things on fire. But what other things do we typically look at when we do this? That's my I've run version bumps around like patch versions, but not this one in the past.
So what I generally do when I've done this is basically I bump the version, watch everything break, and then go through and figure out how to fix it. At the end of the day, the output of the Helm tests for things like the kube client and any of the Helm commands should not change, right? The test output, because we have an SDK, we have things that are going on and other people depend on it. So those things shouldn't change. And so we need to figure out how do we change the internals of whatever broke, so that way everything continues to work the same way within Helm and the tests all pass and everything works as expected.
Got it. Okay. I think those things are working in this case. Like things did break. I did fix those, but there are no tests that were touched. So hopefully nothing really broke.
Okay.
Thank you.
And then we have one last, maybe two. We have one more question. No, a question about an issue. Is the person who asked that on? I don't see my participants list.
Yes, I'm right here.
Hello, welcome.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. So actually, my question was also around Helm templating that has been removed for the CRDs with Helm 3. Actually, the thing is that in our particular repository, like I'm from the Pravega team, and in the Pravega, like for installing Pravega, we also have templatized CRDs right now. So basically we have a conversion webhook section which plugs in values from the values.yaml file, for which currently we are making use of templates. But in order to move seamlessly to the Helm 3 way of handling CRDs, I would need to remove the templates from the CRD. That is my understanding. So I was thinking of asking, what is your prescribed way of handling such situations with the removal of templating from the CRDs in Helm 3?
Okay, so I have a couple of things that I'll throw in here, and maybe somebody else has something along the same lines. The first thing is you can still put CRDs in the templates directory. And the difference is when they're in the CRDs directory, they are installed before the rest of the resources, because sometimes you need those for things in the templates directory. But if you put it in the templates directory, it'll be handled just like any other templated resource. In fact, if you go to the docs, and I just dropped the link in, you'll see that one of the ways you can do that is with a separate chart that has the CRDs, and you install those first. Now, I do want to give you a big warning about templatizing CRDs, and that's because CRDs, they have a whole host of ways that you can break your cluster and break different tenants in your cluster. In fact, Dr. Butcher here even wrote up a lovely document, HIP 11, that is an informational HIP about why CRDs are handled the way they are in Helm 3. And I would suggest you read through it so you can understand some of the things that may happen, so you can try to avoid situations where anything breaks in your cluster, because that can happen with CRDs. But we do have a method where you can still use them as templated resources. Does that help?
It did. So one final question from my side would be that given that we would still want to have some templating, is there any plan of removing the support of adding CRDs within templates in the upcoming Helm version?
No, because that would require a bit of work on our end to filter out just CRDs compared to any other types of resources and custom resources. And so we don't have any plans to filter that out. All right. We are, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Safely proceed with it.
Yes. And because if we were to take it out, we would break backwards compatibility, and we don't want to do that. So you'd see a chart API version v3 before we started doing something like that.
Right. Matt, just one final question from my side. The other concern is that we also do not automatically support CRD upgrades in the new version way of handling CRDs. So, is it something that will be eventually coming in, or do we have to always look at patching our CRD before doing an upgrade?
So I
Given that
think,
we are in the Open API v3 schema validation.
yes, I would suggest you go read the HIP 11 because it explains why we don't have upgrades right now. And it's one of those things that once you get through it, you'll understand the complexities. We have not figured out a good way to handle it, but I think you need the context of that document to understand it.
Sure. I will go through it and get back to you guys if there's anything.
Okay.
And I think the short version on CRD stuff is that we won't make any further changes to CRDs for the remainder of Helm 3's life cycle because it's just too risky to break something. So, however, Helm 4 would be one of those great opportunities if somebody has, reads through HIP 11 and says, wait, I think I have an idea. Helm 4 would be a good chance to start discussing. The Helm 4 HIPs would be a good chance to start discussing. But for Helm 3, I don't think we will make anything even coming close to a breaking change on CRD handling because it's just too risky to break way too many people in very bad ways.
All right.
Sure. Thank you so much, guys.
You're welcome. And so we are now 3 minutes past time. We can go ahead and call it a meeting then, I think. There was one other question, but it was actually answered by Bridget in conversation. And so I think we've covered all of the topics for this week. So thank you everyone for coming and have a wonderful week.